Good afternoon, and welcome to Unapologetic Educational Research addressing anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy. Thank you for spending time with us today. This series is a collaborative effort sponsored by the Department of Educational Studies and the Qual Lab, both entities within the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. My name is Lori Patton Davis, and I serve as chair for the Department of Educational Studies. And I am also a professor of higher education and student affairs. I'm also honored to serve as one of two co-hosts for this series. The purpose of the series is to engage our alums and general audiences in thinking about and reflecting on what it means to conduct educational research from a standpoint that honors Black lives in the research process, while also disrupting racism and white supremacy. Given this critical and turbulent time, we're committed to pushing the landscape of qualitative research and using this research to shift our socio-political context toward racial equity and justice. Each speaker within this series is a nationally recognized educational researcher, and perhaps most special is that each speaker is an alum of our college. We hope you find this series beneficial and educational. We encourage you to take notes, reflect, and consider your standpoint and role in the development and implementation of unapologetic educational research. I'll now turn things over to my colleague and thought partner, Dr. Penny Pasquay.
Hello, thank you, Lori. Let me also share my welcome. We are so glad that you're all here joining us today. My name is Penny Pasquay. My chosen pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a professor in educational studies and director of the college's brand new Qual Lab, where we focus on advancing qualitative inquiry toward equity, diversity, and justice, as well as increasing the capacity regarding qualitative research within our college and beyond. I'm also an editor for the Review of Higher Education. Let me quickly share the outline with you so that you know where we're headed. So we've already shared the housekeeping slide and it will be put in the Q&A for late arrivals, but let me also take a moment to thank everyone behind the scenes who helped us to make this happen. This includes our Qual Lab graduate research assistant, Bakari Lumumba, our closed captioning team members, Office of Advancement, the Dean's office, as well as the Dean. In a minute, the Dean will introduce our guest speaker. And after that, Dr. Rich Milner will share his perspectives on research regarding interrogating the Etic perspective in the new focus on race. Then we'll engage in a dialogue between Dr. Rich Milner, Dr. Lori Patton Davis, and me. The questions will be in the question and answer section throughout. So please add your questions there, and it'll be coordinated by Bakari, who will feed us those questions toward the end. So thank you to Bakari for doing this for us. Finally, we'll take a few minutes to wrap up. And now I have the pleasure of introducing you to our Dean of the College of Education and Human Ecology, Dean Don Pope Davis.
Thank you, Lori and Penny, and good afternoon and welcome to everyone attending our session out there. Thank you for taking the time to do that in this important and continuing conversation that we are having here, here at The Ohio State University in our college. As my colleagues have noted, the purpose of this series is to end educational research practices that uphold white supremacy, racism, and anti-Blackness. As structural and system racism continues to enact violence against Black and brown people, this effort is part of our college's deep commitment to ensure not only that a conversation occurs around racial equality and social justice, but that we are moved to think differently and engage in actions in the current environment that we find ourselves in. Here in our college, we are organized on all levels, from teaching and research to community engagement and college staffing. And today's event is an important part of this effort and conversation. I'm delighted that today's discussion features a particular distinguished researcher and exemplary alumnus of our college, Dr. Rich Milner. Dr. Milner is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Distinguished Professor and Chair of Education in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Peabody College of Vanderbilt University. His research, teaching, and policy interests focus on urban education, teacher education, African American literature, and the social context of education. He has examined practices and policies that support teacher effectiveness in urban schools, and his work has appeared in many important journals. Dr. Milner earned his master's and doctoral degree here at EHE in the College of Education and Human Ecology, and since graduating, he has continued to serve the college and the university. He has been a member of our Alumni Society's Board of Governors and has been recognized with our Alumni Award of Distinction, which is presented to alums who have achieved success in their respective field and have made a difference in the lives of others through their outstanding professional, personal, or community contribution. It is with great distinction and pleasure that I now introduce you to Dr. Milner. Thank you, and please welcome him as part of this event.
Okay, how are you? Are you able to hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Rich.
You are able to hear me. All right, great. Thank you so much for the gracious introduction, Dean Pope Davis. And also I wanna take this opportunity to thank Lori and Penny for the invitation to be here. I believe my parents are out there in virtual land, so I wanna make sure I recognize them as well as my sister, Tanya Milner McCall. I know that you all will be sending me positive vibes as we think about the work moving forward. I'd also want to take an opportunity to recognize Gail McCutcheon, who was my major professor at The Ohio State University. She saw so much in me and gave me an opportunity to pursue my doctoral work here. So I'm very grateful to her, as well as my co-advisor, Anita Wolf-Acoy, who continues to be both a mentor, but also a personal friend, and has really been a difference maker in my life. I also want to recognize other members of my committee, my dissertation committee, and Peter Demerath, anthropologist. Peter Demerath, I learned beside him. I worked laterally to learn so much about field research in real schools in over 3 years, and drawing and learning about ethnography. I want to also take an opportunity to recognize who I call my brother from another mother, Tyrone Howard, who was on my committee. Tyrone has been majorly influential in my life. He was in fact the best man in my wedding. I also want to take this opportunity to recognize and thank Donna Ford, who took me on as a mentee. I was not her advisee, but I can tell you she was a difference maker and has been a difference maker in my career. Very, very thankful to Donna Ford. I also want to take this opportunity to recognize, I know, I'm 5 minutes of recognizing here, but I think it's really important as I think about Ella Baker's question of who your people, right? I really need to pay reverence to these folks. I think about the work of Cynthia Dillard and Dr. Bob Ransom, Dr. Cynthia Dillard and Dr. Bob Ransom, who created the fellowship program that supported many of us in trying to pursue this work in a way that we wouldn't have that cloud of debt, right, as we moved into our work. And, I call my ride or die colleagues and cohort members who were a part of that fellowship program. I recognize D.L. Stewart, the brilliance of D.L. Stewart, who presented a couple of weeks ago, and April Peters Hawkins, who will present in a few weeks, and Joy Gaston and Mark Gooden. All those folks were really influential and have made a difference in my life. So I want to move forward here and talk a bit about the Etic perspective as we think about what I'm calling the new focus on race, I want to be clear here that issues of racism, discrimination, and the like is not new, right? We know from good science, we know from our own experiences that racism, anti-Black racism, and the like have perpetuated and been a part of education and systems of education for a really, really long time, right? But I would like to say that our capacity to understand those intricacies have intensified and amplified through technology. And so when I talk about the new focus on race, I mean we now have the capacity, right, to understand in real time the ways in which issues and systems of oppression and discrimination manifest. If you do tweet, I'm just going to ask that you tag me in the tweet. Hopefully you'll be able to tweet at least twice. I want to hear what might resonate with you throughout. Now, I've only been given a few minutes to share some of my perspectives, but I want to say that if you're interested in more deeply understanding the genesis of some of these ideas, I would encourage you to look at some of these articles here because I will be able to go into more depth. You'll be able to go into more depth around these ideas. In fact, I'm only going to be able to touch on the surface of many of these ideas, but I do believe if you go and read some of these papers, you'll get a better sense of the issues in a more complex and intricate way. I want to start by defining what I mean by race. When I talk about race, I'm not solely talking about phenotype. I'm not talking about skin color only. I'm talking about the fact that race is socially, legally, historically, physically, not biologically, and contextually constructed. So when you mention the word race, you have to understand that we're talking about a complex phenomenon, if you will, which requires deep levels of analyses and historical understanding to really be able to interrogate race in a powerful way. To give you some context related to this idea of Etic, the Etic and Emic actually emerged from linguistics, and we have adopted it, of course, in education and through anthropology to really think about the Emic perspective, which is really the perspective, the worldviews, the voices, the stories that show up and manifest with our research participants, with the folks with whom we're working. And the Etic perspective tends to be our perspective as outsiders, those of us who are conducting research with and on behalf of communities. And so I want us to sort of think about this notion of what does it mean to engage and do this work in a space where we might be outside of the community in which we are studying. I think it's great that people have a new sort of focus and commitment to issues of race, but I also want to caution us that this work has to be done deliberately and it has to be done carefully. Otherwise, we can perpetuate and create systems that actually perpetuate inequity. So the framing question that I want us to think about is, what does it mean and what could it mean for white folk to engage in the work of race, racial justice, and racism, particularly in this moment, And so I want to talk about 5 opportunities that I believe we have to push and perhaps reimagine qualitative research in this moment. The first opportunity that I believe we have is I believe we have a great opportunity to reimagine how we talk about issues of racism, issues of discrimination, and the like in the work we do. We have an opportunity to reimagine our talk, our discourse, our discursive interactions in this moment. I also believe that we have an opportunity to create and to co-construct translational, accessible, multi-layered analysis of race and racism in this moment, unlike ever in the past. Opportunity 3, I believe we have an opportunity to trouble the ways in which we interpret our interpretations, our storying of how we've not responsibly and adequately focused on Black girls and women in our work. And I'm drawing here and thinking about the importance of intersectionality, drawing from the powerful work of Kimberly Crenshaw. We have an opportunity to study and build ecological systems and tools and frameworks that reject what I call context neutral approaches by troubling, nuancing, and complexifying place, space, and environment through the lived experiences of folks, and particularly people of color. And fifth, we have an opportunity to design studies that deliberately center and connect with society and education for what I want to suggest, the human condition. And so when we talk about opportunity and opportunity structure, right, we have an opportunity to think about and to move beyond issues of racial inequality or racial inequity related to achievement. I know some of y'all have heard me talk about this in the past, but I want to push forward this idea that we shouldn't focus in on achievement gaps. In fact, focusing in on achievement gaps puts us and places us and shepherds us into a place where we are focusing in on student outcomes and not thinking very carefully about how systems and mechanisms reproduce themselves, right? And what we know from good science is that when mechanisms are in place to support our young people, they succeed. And so I want to suggest that we don't have an achievement gap, but what we really have are gaps in caring. And we don't have an achievement gap, but what we really have are gaps in grace. And we don't have an achievement gap, but we have a gap in vulnerability. You know, I'll never forget the day when I was teaching high school English, and the day when the administrative associate knocked on the trailer of my classroom and asked me to step out, and I stepped out on the porch area, and she told me that my grandmother had transitioned. Right, I stepped back into the classroom and continued attempting to teach, and I broke down, right, and started crying, and I'll never forget the kind of response I received from my students, right, because I showed myself vulnerable in that space, right, and it allowed them to see me as a human being. We don't have an achievement gap, but we have gaps in technology and gaps in healthcare and gaps in what I want to say, justice, and gaps in justice. If we talk about these gaps, right, if we reimagine how we talk about the realities of what's happening, I believe we have an opportunity to change our belief systems, right, our epistemological ways of knowing, to do work to improve the human condition. I also think we have to reimagine, right, how we talk about at-risk students and so forth. And some folks, even the most liberal among us, right, will do anything or will go about their business and won't say Black Lives Matter, right? Even the most liberal white people, right, will engage in this work and never say Black Lives Matter, right? And you know, this discourse around all lives matter, of course, is troubling, right? And we have to disrupt, we have to complicate, and we have to really move into places where we refuse to allow all lives matter kind of discourse to take place, because we know for sure that how can all lives matter when Black lives tend not to, right? And also drawing from the work of Prudence Carter and Dumas and Ross and others, right? This idea that we're not only grappling with racism, we're grappling with anti-Black racism, right? And so that languaging is essential as we move forward in this quote unquote new normal. What I want to leave you with, what do you mean, Rich? What I mean is when we change the way we talk about injustices, we can concurrently change our epistemologies and our ways of knowing related to what's happening in education and what's happening in society. Opportunity two, I think we have an opportunity to co-construct multi-layered analyses related to race, racism, and anti-Blackness. On the left-hand side, you see a young Black person who's read as a male man here being confined by the police, and we see Dylan Roof, who killed 9 parishioners in Charleston, South Carolina, right? And he walks out, and they bought Dylan a hamburger, right, to appease his appetite, right? So we think about the ways in which society shepherds us into these spaces of believing that some bodies, right, are more valued or more valuable, than our other lives, that's a space of interrogation that we have to constantly think about. If you're doing this work from an Etic perspective, you've got to understand, you've got to peel back the multi-layered work, right? That is not only in education, but is also historical and is also well linked to the lived experiences of folks in society. Opportunity to, and this work is not only about thinking about our pain in this work, right? It's also about the relentless efforts, the unwavering efforts of folk, right, who are on the front lines, disrupting systems of oppression, right? So we think about, and I think it's important when you look at these photos that we talk very carefully about who's in the audience, right? Who's doing this work, right? So it's not only that we're talking about Black bodies, but let me just be clear here, that white is a race too. And so as we attempt to understand and complexify and try to make sense of what's happening in this moment, we've got to understand what my colleague Bettina Love calls co-conspirators, right? So, you know, this notion that you see Black bodies there and brown bodies and white bodies and so forth, tell us that we're in a moment where when we think about addressing race, we have an opportunity to address race in very, very complex ways. The issue is not about white bodies, right? The issue is not about, the issue is about how we use, how white people use their influence, right, to maintain the status quo. How whiteness is maintained through what they do, how whiteness shows up to maintain white supremacy, and how whiteness maintains injustice, right? And so we need to understand and peel back the layers of what that work means. I hope you all can hear me. Say something in the chat, if you will. The other point that I want to make clear is that we must trouble the inadequate focus that we've had on Black girls and Black women and think about it intersectionally, right? How is it that the murder of George Floyd sparked an international protest, right? And just days prior, the death of Breonna Taylor did not, right? There's something about the way we see the world. There's something about the way we interpret whose lives matter, right? That is not only central to our gendered bodies, but it's also, our racial bodies, but it's also well connected to how we think about gender and how we think about gender oppression collectively. Opportunity 4 is we have an opportunity to study and build ecological and contextual tools that push us forward, especially in this moment. We have an opportunity to talk about the place and the spaces that where we find that the alarming and disproportionate number of hospitalizations and deaths of Black and brown folks from COVID. We have an opportunity to think about the places of these shootings, right? Of bodies such as Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rekia Boyd, and Antoine Rose Jr. We have an opportunity to think about the places of immigration debates, right? And where children, right, some 540 something still separated from their families and placed in fenced cages. We have an opportunity in this moment, right, to think about the place and the spaces, including policies, right, on a national level that can move us forward. We can think about environmental injustice related to the Flint, Michigan water crisis. We can think about the brutal shooting of 9 parishioners in Charleston, South Carolina. We can think about the Unite the Right rally that killed co-conspirator Heather Heyer. Those issues are essential to the way in which we build systems and ecological approaches to advance and move us forward. Opportunity 5 is I think we have an opportunity to design studies that connect society and education to improve the human condition. What do you mean, Rich Milner? I am saying that in this moment, we have an opportunity to disrupt all of the pontification that we do among those of us in educational research, right? We have an opportunity to think about and talk to real people in the trenches in what I call the real world, right? So I want to suggest that in this moment, we can theorize all day long. We can develop research studies that get us awards and all kinds of things. But if this work is not transferable and it does not make a difference in the real lives of real people, I want to suggest that we're not really doing the work. The work is not only about talking about the issues, right? The work is taking up these injustices and reimagining policy, practice, and tools, right, that move us forward. So as we think about societal realities like the killings of these bodies, right, and the killings and murders of these bodies, the violence against these bodies, societally, we also have an opportunity to think about how discursively incarceration rates and issues related to who proportionately are experiencing the carceral system at alarming rates, right? We have an opportunity to make it clear that there are stories behind the stats. So these are just, these bodies are not solely and not simply a news feed, right? These are real people with real experiences and so forth. And we have to interrogate through qualitative research, right? Through the work we do, we have to build the storylines related to those bodies. When we look at this research on a national level, we also see that, you know, Black students represent about 16% of the general population, and they represent 32% of those students who experience in-school suspension. We know that Black students, again, represent about 40% of those students who experience outside of school suspension. And so those data tell us, right, that on a macro level, we have stories that we need to tell outside. And if we look at the data and we look at the insights from Columbus, right, we see a very similar trend. Black students represent about 54% of the school population enrollment. They represent 70% of in-school suspension. So the multi-layered ways in which we look at this is not only on the national level, it's also on a meso level, right? It is not only on a macro, it's a meso level as well. And interrogating, right, what these data might mean for real people, so they understand it. It's just not a stat, right? It's just not a news feed. Pushes us and it advances us to a place where we might be able to engage in the human condition. We think about the fact that outside of school suspensions, there are about 72% of Black students, right? And people have a nerve to ask me why I'm focusing on Black students, right? And if you look at these data, when you look at expulsion rates, right, we also know that about 75% of expulsion rates are for Black students. On a micro level, right, we need to tell the stories of what happens when young people are, you know, what these data manifest and how they look in real time, right? So when you look at this young girl being pulled from her desk, right, the violence, the fact that someone could place that kind of aggression on a body, on a child, right, speaks volumes about how we think about it. And so your Etic perspective, your research has to look not only with your head, it has to look with your heart as well, because we're talking about human beings here who have been grossly underserved. So the macro data, the meso level data is here, but the micro level data is what's happening every day in the classroom. I want to suggest that a multi-layered macro, meso, micro level of analyses are essential. I think I'm out of time. I would play this, but I also want to suggest that, you know, on a micro level, we're still looking at poorly funded schools, right? And we're also looking at overcrowded classrooms. When you look at, and proportionally, you look at the data at classrooms that are overly populated, right? You see who those bodies are. They're Black and brown bodies. And then economists have a nerve to question whether or not the reduction of class size leads to economic positive effects, right? Let me just be clear here, right? The quantitative data tell us very little about the quality, right, of what these students' lived experiences are, what their students' lived experiences are when they're piled in these classrooms, in these spaces. It's a form of violence. It's a form of violence. And so I want to conclude with, our research has the potential to make a difference. Our research has an opportunity to make a difference. And some research is going to be transformative in ways that others won't. But I think we have to really press forward with the fortitude to get better. So thank you. Woo.
Woo! I'm so inspired by you and your work, your important work. So I just want to take a breath and also say, yes, Black Lives Matter. And as you were just talking about the quality of lives, Black Lives Matter in research, in real life. And so what Lori and I are starting with in the dialogue, asking every presenter is, what does anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy in educational research mean to you? How do you address these complexities in your research, which you've already addressed, but could continue to talk about?
Well, I would just say that, you know, addressing and thinking about anti-Blackness means everything to me, you know, and I think, and it has to when one is conducting this kind of research. I think it has to be centrally part, right, of how people approach the work from the beginning of the research studies, right. So it's not just some arbitrary, I'm going to read some papers that I have not read before, right? Although that's important, it's also about sort of transforming your very being, right? Transforming, you know, who you are and how you engage and see and interact with the world, right? And so it's this notion that your syllabi should look differently, right? And I want to say to every doctoral student, every student enrolled in a class, right? If you don't have strong representation, right, of Black, brown, indigenous communities on your syllabus, that's a problem, right? And what has happened is perpetually the science that people believe matters, or the science, right, that folks have decided are most important, right, is seen as the canon, the canonical ways in which we come to know, right, even in qualitative research. So I want to suggest that, you know, many of those ideas show up and manifest through the real life lived experiences of scholars of color. So when you look at the work of people who've been doing this work, you know, for decades, right, I think it's essential that we think about, you know, how we construct our courses, how we reproduce the same people, the same kinds of folks over and over and over again through hiring practices. You know, this notion of fit is problematic, right? Because we decide that if you don't work with X as a student, if your advisor is not X or Y, then somehow you're not capable of being successful in a particular place. And so while we talk about this idea that in the abstraction, which is what we often do, you know, when we talk about race, when we talk about injustice, when we theorize, we pontificate, that's what we tend to do, right? But I want to just suggest that individuals make systems. So the work can't only, when we think about race and we think about institutional racism, discrimination, and the like, the analyses can't stop at the broader systematic level. We had to, because otherwise we start to believe that the fallacy that you know, that somehow this is some abstraction that nobody can change. Now, we are creating these systems, right? And so, and we allow these things to happen over and over and over and over again. So I got a little excited there, but I don't know if I answered your questions.
Thank you so much, Rich, for your comments. I wanted to ask a question. From when you first started the presentation, you talked about, you know, how do we encourage white colleagues to engage in this work, and understanding that this is a larger effort, like all researchers need to be engaged. But I wonder what your thoughts are on the dynamics, like how would you encourage your white graduate students, for example, or your white colleagues in terms of engaging in this work? And I'm asking this from the perspective, and I think like broadly. So as you were talking, things that came to mind were a lot of the more recent films that we've seen that feature Black lives are produced and, you know, written by white people, right? And so there is some benefit that goes to them. Or there are some white colleagues I've seen who do the work on Black people, Black women, and it's really important work, right? But it's not necessarily a commitment, you know? So how do you recommend working with folks on their positionality to understand that in doing this research, it's not to do it to sort of pimp the system to get a lot of research out there, right, on Black people, or to be perceived as woke or whatever, but that there is an honest commitment and there is a positionality there that shows up in the work, so that when we read it, you know, there's no question around whether or not this person is committed.
Yeah, Laura, I think that's an excellent question. You know, I think about my own work. I just want to be clear here that the Etic talks not only about, you know, white people being outside of the, right, the Etic really is about how do those of us outside of a community deeply engage with that community in a way, and with fidelity and with, you know, a level of respect, right, and the rejection of exploitation. I think is really important. And when I think about this idea of researcher positionality, like I really was grappling myself when I, at one point when I wrote the race, culture, researcher positionality paper, I was really trying to grapple with and work through my own issues of what it meant to be a Black man studying mostly white women in teacher ed, right? And so I understood and I respected the fact that my worldview, my experiences, my epistemological ways of knowing were deeply shaped by my biography, my history, my preferences, the ways in which I experienced my privileges, right? And so I had to engage and constantly engage in levels of reflection that allow me to show myself strong, as my grandmother would say, right? So it wasn't enough for me to say I am a Black man doing this research, you know, with white women. You know, I had to really interrogate and because just like it you know, I'm encouraging people to really interrogate their own life worlds, phenomenologically speaking, in this moment. I also have to not be a hypocrite in the work that I do as well. So, you know, I think the first layer here is to really understand how power and how white supremacy manifests. So, you know, white people tend to, I don't want y'all to get mad at me, but I'm just going to say it. White people have a tendency to believe they know everything. So there's this notion of, oh, I've read those articles, and they'll tell you more about yourself, right? Than you think you might know about. So it is this constant reminder, right, that you are engaging in a community. I don't care how many books you've read, I don't care where you've gone to school, like you're engaging in a community and with a community, and that means you have to operate as you're going through the Etic. You have to operate through a space where it allows you and it constantly is necessary for you to constantly engage in this level of self-reflection. So that means immersing yourself in the community, right? You could talk about this idea of community investment. You can talk about this notion of community attendance. You can talk about this idea of community immersion. You can talk, there are lots of ways to kind of think about, how we do it. But I would, you know, just really say when I moved to the University of Pittsburgh, when I left Vanderbilt and moved to the University of Pittsburgh, my first year at the University of Pittsburgh, I did not do any systematic research in that place, right? Because not only, it's so important, right, for researchers to remember that you're working with real people, you're working with folks who have been harmed and are grappling with and working through varying layers of trauma. And so I don't care how I showed up at the church on Sunday morning, right? I don't care how I showed up in the synagogue or wherever that work was in the community at the recreation center, right? I was seen as the system at the University of Pittsburgh. And so I had to develop relationships with people such that they understood I was not there to solely take from them, right? And so this idea that I was trying to immerse myself in that place, and I didn't write a thing. Right, I didn't write a thing. And in a very similar way, I think really immersing ourselves in this work requires that we're doing it. And I think the other point I would make is that, you know, this work in the spirit of qualitative research has to be anchored by our why, right? And so, you know, in this moment, as we think about, you know, this racial reckoning, as we think about this notion that we have an opportunity to engage race in ways unlike we've ever seen before, like I also believe we must engage in a way that we are doing the work for the right reason. We're doing the work for the right reason. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I want to say.
You did. Thank you.
And to me, you're talking a lot about the ontological, the living, the breathing, the being of approaches. I mean, I know you mentioned the epistemological, but there's a way in which, with Indigenous scholars like Sean Wilson, talk about how these ontological, epistemological, axiological are all connected. You cannot pull them out. They are absolutely interconnected. And I think that living and breathing piece is so important as scholars. We're actually reading your piece this week in qualitative research about the dangers, the seen dangers you can see in harming communities, the unseen, the unforeseen dangers. I appreciate hearing about how you approach that piece and your work as you kind of push the field. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Lori, do you want to ask another question before we move to Q&A? I'm trying to watch time too.
I will yield my question to those in the Q&A because I see some good questions in there.
Bakari, welcome. Please.
Welcome. Yes, well, just want to say once again, we want to thank Dr. Milner for a powerful presentation, right? I felt like I was back in church again, right? Going to do some call and response. But we're going to get right into it. We have some very powerful, engaging questions for you, Dr. Milner. So the first question is from Brianna Parker, and she asks, can you talk briefly about how you can build a storyline of research with the people who are involved in our study through reimagine and contextually engaged qualitative research?
You ask that one more time for me, Bakari.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So if you could briefly speak on how one can build a storyline of research with the people who are involved in a study through reimagine and contextually engaged qualitative research.
Yeah, I think, while we're talking about, thank you for that question. I think as we were talking about what it means to search the self in this work, which is a lot of what I've attempted to advance in my own work related to positionality. I think we also have a responsibility to work with, on behalf of a community, and I think that pushes beyond the gauge of only writing about, but writing with as well. There's something very powerful about that. We are, my current work is I'm actually examining teaching practices in through the carceral system, right? And so think about the complexity, the contradiction of thinking about emancipatory practices, right? And an institution that inherently controls, and right? So I've been writing about and trying to understand the complexities of what those instructional practices might look like. To build on something I wanted to say about Penny's point earlier, which I thought was a really powerful one. In addition to thinking about, the ontological, the axiological, the epistemological sort of confluence, if you will, I think in a very similar way, as we're conducting this research, we also have to think about the multi-layered dimensions of what it means to do macro, meso, micro level analyses that allow us on a micro level to do exactly what I'm attempting to try to get, to try to answer in Bakari's, in the question that Bakari brought forward. So it is this space of, I understand that I am a learner in this space. I understand that if we talk about authoring, right, I understand that I have an obligation to make sure that I am building on the problem spaces that our units of analyses, right, are not only negotiated but prioritized from and with the community. So, as we are going into community to work with community, we go in, of course, thinking about a priority, thinking about emergent things that we want to broad questions, even in the messiness of how we think about doing our research. But let's just be clear, you know, through our ego, we can sometimes, and maybe I'm not talking about y'all, maybe I'm just talking about myself, but through the ways in which we think we've come to know as educational researchers, we can sometimes prioritize our own questions, prioritize our own methodological tools, prioritize. And what I've come to understand and thinking about my own children is that if you ask a child, if you ask a young person, or if you ask a community, right, where the work or where the real issues are, they'll tell you, right? And so it's that negotiative, that negotiation space that I think is really important as we think about doing research with that can really be transformative.
Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that. So our next question is rather provocative. It's coming from Maddie Phillips, and she says that she's an educator in an urban school. And she states that the harsh reality is that we have many Karens in our schools who traumatize the Black youth and are too often not held accountable for their actions. They do not give a flying fig leaf, as she states, about being or developing an anti-racist paradigm. How can we expect Black intellectual growth when Karen is the administrator and seems to be content with the negative data you are providing?
Wow. Phillips, what a part. You're going to really try to get me in trouble here, like, right? You know, like, let me start by saying, from what I've come to understand is, you know, educators, teachers tend to have great intentions, right? I have very rarely met an explicitly racist teacher, for instance, or an explicitly, you know, but so much of their belief systems, right? The way they've come to see the world. I'm reminded of the work of Professor Emerita Beverly Gordon's work, where she talks about the fact that it's difficult to critique the world and work to change it when the world works for you. Like, for so many of these educators, like, the world is working for them. And although they say they love their babies, they love their children, right? They're not in a place where they're willing to tear back and think about their own privileges, the ways in which their own ways of being in the world perpetuate an inequitable status quo. And so, you know, I think what we have to do is we've got to really reimagine how we support these teachers. One of the challenges I have with this whole focus on trauma and this whole focus on you know, implicit bias and so forth. And I've not said this about trauma because I wasn't quite ready for folks to really get mad at me. But, you know, let me just say that I feel like it's problematic. The area of trauma and thinking about grief and traumatic experience is real. Let me say that among our young people. But what it also does is it gives, I think, educators a rationale to look outwardly. You know, in a very similar way when we talk about poverty. We place the locus of control. We think psychologically, when we talk about locus of control, it is, you know, it's not me as the teacher, right? It's not me as the administrator. It is what's happening in the home. It's what's happening in the community, right? Right, which is why these multi-layered dimensions are important. And so I think it has the potential to, when we focus in on trauma without interrogating the ways in which schools actually reproduce trauma, how schools actually reproduce suffering, Black suffering, as Michael Dumas would say, it shepherd us into a place where we don't take any responsibility. So just in a very similar way, right, that we think about how we build tools to be more responsive to and relevant to the communities in which we work. In a very similar way, we have an opportunity to think about how we better support teachers. And so we're in ed schools, y'all, right? Most of us are in ed schools, in education schools. And so, you know, I want to suggest that when we think about the work of administration, we have an opportunity, we have a responsibility, more than an opportunity, we have a responsibility to help those Karens, right? To help those people who are in those schools, because what I've come to understand for sure is, you know, I would much prefer working with and trying to support these teachers, trying to support these educators to build the tools, to build a repertoire, the repository to be, to build the kind of practices, assessment practices, curriculum practices, you know, pedagogical practices that align with the genius, align with the expertise, align with the assets of our young folk, right? Then to operate from a place where we critique. One last thing I'd like to say is that there are dangers, there are what I call, the woke crowd, right? The woke crowd is the woke crowd that tends to be hypercritical, and they tend to be, so critical to the degree that all they do is identify and analyze what's wrong with other people, with other layers of scholarship. And let me be clear, I'm a critical race theorist, so I understand the role of the critical, right? And the fun part, Bakari, from my view, is the theory, right? But the hard work is critiquing. It's critiquing forward. So in other words, like, rather than spending all of our energy and efforts at the critique level, like, step back and and help us figure out what needs to happen to be transformative. And so for all my woke folks out there, right? Your job is not only to critique and talk about how woke you are. Like, your job also is to get in, is to help in the work with systems, individuals, and so forth, to try to create transformation with and for the human condition. So.
Right, powerful, powerful. And just want to let everyone know that is submitting their questions that we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions, so please charge it to my head, not my heart. Please don't take it personal. So we have another question coming from Sharon Rad, and she says that she appreciates your definition of race that goes beyond skin color to include multiple dimensions. She wants to know, can you repeat those dimensions that you listed?
Sure. Well, one of the things I think is important is I want to give a shout out actually to the Handbook on Critical Race Theory. Adrian Dixon and Marvin Lynn have revised the Handbook on Critical Race Theory. I have a chapter in it with one of our doctoral students, Mariah Harmon, and my great colleague, Ebony McGee. The three of us have a paper, a chapter in that handbook. But I would just like to say that a lot of, so really deep, intricate ways of thinking about issues of race are in that, in that handbook. My conceptualizations of how I think about race have emerged from many, many different spaces. And so one would be the social construction, which is what most of us agree with. Most of us agree that race doesn't, those in the health sciences make the argument that race doesn't even exist, right? So it's socially constructed. So the social constructed, there's an historical construction of race that we also have to understand. And that means going back and looking at the genesis of the powerful work of folks like Jim Anderson and the powerful work of folks like Vanessa Sitter Walker. Like that historical work is so essential as we think about the ways in which race has manifested and shown up over, over periods of time. I think that's another important piece. We know that contextually, race shows up and it manifests differently in North America than it does in South America. It manifests differently, on different continents. And so, and even we think, spatially, geographically, we can talk about race in terms of space, which is a smaller, more micro level way of thinking about space. You can think about space or context on a broader level, where we might think about place. Place might be considered, broader. We might think about race even broader than a school district. So we might think about space as micro classroom. We might think about place as meso school district. We might think about, or district, and we might think about environment as macro national, right? So the context, the place is so important, and the way we talk about and make sense of race. We also know that race is physically, not biologically constructed. So in other words, if you think about why we find variation in skin pigmentation, we know that it is our relationship to the sun, our relationship to the equator, right? So we are virtually, which is why those in the human science, those in the health sciences say that we're the same. Like, why, they ask us, they query us in the social sciences, like, why in the world y'all talking about this race thing, right? And it becomes our units of analysis. So understanding, I think, those multi-layers are important.
Very good. I think we have time for one. No, we don't have time for another question. So we're going to move to closing.
All right. Thank you, Bakari.
No problem.
Rich, I want to, really thank you. Well, we all thank you for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and your expertise with us today. For those of you who are interested in learning more about his work, please see this slide. There's information, and there will also be links added to the chat. Rich, of course, there's a gift forthcoming to you as a great alum of OSU. I do want to also share 2 additional announcements. As you all know, our college is answering the call by fighting for diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice through our research, teaching, and service to the larger community, but we can't do this fight alone. So we ask you to consider supporting this work through a donation and helping us to reach a goal of raising $15,000 by November 16th. There is a link that will be placed in the chat, and we would greatly appreciate any contribution from those of you in the audience. And then the last announcement. So after every good session, there's the after party. So I would like to encourage all of you to consider attending the American Educational Research Association's Brown Lecture. It's an annual lecture that they have that features the important role of research in advancing and understanding equality and equity in education. And Dr. Milner was actually one of the speakers 2 years ago. This year's speaker is Dr. William Tate from the University of South Carolina. Again, a link is in the chat box if you all are interested in participating in that session, which will, I believe, be at 6 p.m. this evening.
I also want to say thank you, Dr. Milner, and thank you to everyone who attended today. We're going to be sending you a survey so that we can actually incorporate your feedback as we move forward. So please take a minute if you have the opportunity to do that. Our next session is on Thursday, November 12th with Dr. April Peters-Hawkins at the same time. So we really do need you to continue your own unapologetic educational research. So please take this, continue to make magic. We need this. Thank you again for taking the time, and we'll see you next time.